The alien empire saw Earth's fleet, then realized every ship was different. Far beyond the edge of known space, the Zathari Empire ruled over 400 star systems. Their fleet was a thing of beauty, at least to them. Every warship in their navy looked the same. Every cruiser had the same shape, the same color, the same weapons in the same places. This was not by accident, it was Zathari law. Uniformity meant order. Order meant strength, and strength was the only thing the Empire trusted. Grand Admiral Vekthor Zul had commanded the 3rd Battle Fleet for over 30 cycles. He was proud of his ships. When he looked out across the black of space and saw his fleet arranged in perfect formation, he felt something close to peace. 200 cruisers, all identical, moving as one. Each ship carried the same crew structure, the same command codes, the same engines built in the same factory, on the same day. If you had shown Vekthor a single Zathari ship, he could tell you everything about the other 1,000 ships in the Empire's navy. That was the point. The Zathari had built their empire on this idea. Long ago, in the early years of their expansion, different Zathari clans had built their own ships in their own styles. The result had been chaos. Fleets that could not communicate well. Commanders who did not understand each other's tactics. Repairs that took twice as long because no two ships used the same parts. After a terrible war between two rival Zathari factions, the Empire's first emperor had passed a new law. From that day on, every ship built by the Empire would follow one design, one template, one standard. It had worked. For 1,000 years, the Zathari Empire had grown strong because of this discipline. Their fleets never had supply problems. Their commanders always knew exactly what every ship could do, because every ship could do the exact same thing. War, to the Zathari, was a simple equation. Count the ships. Count the guns. Multiply by the standard combat rating. Whichever side had the bigger number would win. This was why, when the scout ship Ilvantu came back from a routine patrol near an unmapped star system, and its captain reported something strange, Vekthor almost did not believe it. "Admiral, we found a fleet," said Captain Reshna, the young Zathari officer who had led the scouting mission. She stood at attention in Vekthor's command chamber, aboard the flagship Voice of Order. Her 4 eyes blinked in a nervous pattern that Vekthor recognized. She was unsettled. "A fleet from which species?" Vekthor asked. "Are they hostile? Do they belong to the Kren, or the Ashu collective?" "We do not know who they are, Admiral. We have never seen this species before. Their ships came from a system we call Designation 7 Alpha. Local star charts, if this species has any, would likely call it Sol." Vekthor frowned. He had heard of this system before, in old reports. A single yellow star, with a handful of planets, one of them blue and green and full of water. Scouts had passed by it centuries ago, and found nothing worth noting. No advanced signals, no space travel, just a primitive species stuck on their homeworld, fighting each other over small patches of land. "They have left their planet then," Vekthor said. "How many ships?" 41, Admiral." Vekthor almost laughed. 41 ships was nothing. His own 3rd battle fleet alone numbered 200 cruisers, each one far larger and more powerful than anything a new species could build in their first few centuries of space travel. This was not a threat. This was barely worth his attention. 41 ships, he repeated. "And why does this concern me, Captain? Send a probe. Catalog their weapons. Estimate their combat rating. This is standard procedure." "Admiral, that is the problem," Reshna said. "We tried to estimate their combat rating. We could not." "Explain." Reshna reached into her uniform and pulled out a data slate. She placed it on the projection table in the center of the chamber, and the air above the table filled with a shimmering hologram. 41 ships appeared, floating in formation. Vekthor stared at the image, and for a long moment, he said nothing at all. Every single ship was different. Not different in small ways, like a scratch on the hull, or a slightly different paint job. Different in every way that mattered. One ship was long and thin, built for speed, with engines that glowed a strange blue color. Another ship near it was short and wide, covered in thick plating, clearly built for heavy combat, bristling, with what looked like more weapons than a ship its size should carry. A third ship looked almost fragile, with wide sensor arrays spread out like wings, clearly built for scanning and communication rather than fighting. "This cannot be correct," Vekthor said. Are you certain these are all part of the same fleet? Perhaps you found multiple fleets from different species, traveling together by coincidence. We were certain of the same thing, Admiral, at first, Reshna said, but we intercepted their communications. They speak the same language. They use the same command codes to talk to each other. They fly in formation together, coordinated, like a single fleet under one command. But no two ships share a design. No two ships share the same weapons layout. Some of the ships appear to have been built for entirely different purposes, and only recently modified for war. Vector leaned closer to the hologram, studying each ship one at a time. There were 41 distinct shapes, each one telling a different story. One ship had clearly been built for exploring deep space, with massive fuel tanks and minimal weapons, but someone had bolted heavy cannons onto its hull, awkward and mismatched, like a farmer strapping a sword to a plow. Another looked like a passenger transport, the kind of ship built to carry civilians, but its hull had been reinforced with thick armor plates that did not match the rest of the design at all. They have converted civilian ships into warships, Vector said slowly. It appears that way, Admiral, not all of them. Some of the 41 do appear to be purpose-built warships, but even among those, the designs vary wildly. It is as though every shipyard on their homeworld built its own version of a warship, without any shared plan. Vector sat back in his chair. This should have made him laugh. A fleet with no standardization, no shared doctrine, cobbled together from whatever ships this new species happened to have lying around. By every rule the Zathari Empire had ever learned about warfare, this fleet should be an easy target. Weak, disorganized, a joke. And yet something about it made the hair on the back of his neck rise. Actually, the Zathari did not have hair, but they had a ridge of sensitive skin along their spine that reacted the same way, and it was reacting now. What is their combat rating? He asked again. We do not know, Admiral. Our scoring system requires a baseline. It requires us to know what a standard ship of this species looks like, so we can calculate the fleet's total strength by counting how many standard units they have. This fleet has no standard units. Every ship is a different question we cannot yet answer. For the first time in many cycles, Grand Admiral Vector Zul felt something he had almost forgotten. He felt uncertain. Show me their patrol pattern, he said. Show me everything you recorded. Reshna adjusted the hologram, and new information filled the space above the table. Vector watched as the 41 ships moved through space, not in a rigid formation like his own fleet, but in something looser. Something that flowed and shifted depending on what each ship was doing. The fast, thin ship darted ahead to scout. The heavily armored ship stayed near the center, like a shield. The ship with the wide sensor arrays hung back, watching everything, feeding information to the others. It was not chaos, Vector realized slowly. It only looked like chaos at first glance. Underneath the surface, there was a kind of order to it, but it was not the order the Zathari valued. It was not sameness. It was something else. Something that used difference as a strength, instead of hiding it away. Have they detected us? Vector asked. Unknown, Admiral. We stayed at maximum sensor range, but their ship with the wide arrays, we believe it may have picked up a trace of our probe before we withdrew. Vector stood up from his chair and walked slowly around the table, studying the hologram from every angle. He had fought against a dozen different species in his career. He had crushed rebellions within the Empire itself, back when some of the outer colonies had tried to break Zathari law and build their own ship designs. He knew what an enemy fleet was supposed to look like. He knew how to read strength from a formation, how to calculate danger from a silhouette. He did not know how to read this. Send a full report to the Emperor's court, Vector said finally, and prepare the third battle fleet for a closer approach. I want to see this species' ships with my own eyes, not through a probe's recordings. Yes, Admiral. Should we prepare for combat? Vector considered this. 41 mismatched ships against 200 Zathari cruisers, all identical, all following the same proven doctrine that had won the Empire 1,000 years of victories. The math still favored him, overwhelmingly. There was no reason to fear this small, strange fleet. And yet, prepare for combat, he said. But do not engage unless they engage first. I want to understand them before I destroy them. There may be something valuable to learn here. Reshna saluted and left to relay the orders. Vector remained alone in the command chamber, staring at the hologram of the 41 ships a moment longer. He reached out and touched the image of the smallest ship in the fleet, a strange little vessel barely larger than a shuttle, covered in patchwork armor that looked like it had been welded on in pieces, probably during actual combat repairs rather than in a proper shipyard. Why would any species send such an obviously weak, unfinished-looking ship into space, alongside real warships? It made no sense by Zathari standards. A weak ship only weakened the fleet around it. It was a liability. It should have been left behind, or scrapped for parts to reinforce the stronger ships. Unless, Vector thought, this species did not think about strength the way the Zathari did. He dismissed the thought. It was speculation, nothing more. He would learn the truth soon enough. The third battle fleet began its slow approach toward Designation 7 Alpha, 200 identical cruisers moving in perfect formation, gliding through the dark toward a small, strange fleet that refused to make any sense. 3 days later, the voice of order dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system, and Vector got his first direct look at Earth's fleet with his own sensors, not a scout's second-hand report. What he saw did not calm his unease. If anything, it deepened it. The 41 ships were spread out in a loose net formation around the third planet, the blue and green world the humans called home. As his own fleet's sensors swept across them, more details emerged. Ships built from salvaged asteroid mining equipment. Ships that looked like they had been assembled from parts of 3 or 4 different older designs, welded together in whatever way worked. A handful of ships that did look purpose-built, sleek and clearly designed for war. But even these did not match each other. One had heavy frontal armor and slow, powerful engines, built like a battering ram. Another was fast and lightly armored, clearly built to strike quickly and retreat. Vector called for his tactical officer, a Zathari named Osun who had served with him for 15 cycles. "Give me your assessment," Vector said. Osun studied the readings for a long moment before answering. "Admiral, by every metric we use to judge fleet strength, this is a weak force. Their total tonnage is a fraction of ours. Their weapons technology, based on energy signatures, appears to be roughly 2 centuries behind Zathari standard. If this were any other species, I would recommend immediate engagement. We would win in minutes." "But?" Osun hesitated, which was unusual for him. "But I cannot build a reliable tactical model, Admiral. Every simulation I run assumes some consistency in the enemy fleet. A model that works against their armored ship fails completely against their fast ship. A model that accounts for their fast ship does nothing to predict what their strange little patchwork vessels might do. I have run 41 separate simulations, one for each ship, and I still do not have a single fleet-wide strategy that accounts for all of them at once." Vector nodded slowly. This matched his own instinct. "Continue your analysis. I want a full report before we make contact." As his officers worked, Vector stood at the viewport and looked out at the distant blue planet, home to a species that built no 2 ships alike, and yet somehow moved them together as one fleet. He thought again of the old stories from Zathari history, of the chaos before the standardization laws, of rival clans and mismatched fleets that could not work together. But this was different, he realized. Those old Zathari clans had been chaotic because they refused to cooperate. This human fleet was cooperating perfectly. They simply refused to be the same while doing it. It was, Vector thought, the strangest thing he had encountered in 30 cycles of service to the Empire. And somewhere deep in his mind, a small and unwelcome thought began to take root. Perhaps the Zathari way was not the only way to build a fleet that could win. He did not yet know how right that thought would turn out to be. Grand Admiral Vector Zul spent the next 2 days doing something he had never done before in his long career. He watched. He did not attack. He did not send a threat message demanding surrender, as Zathari doctrine usually required when meeting a weaker species. He simply sat at the edge of the Sol system with his 200 identical cruisers and studied the 41 strange, mismatched human ships. The more his officers gathered data, the more confused they became. "Admiral, we have identified names for several of their ships," said Osun, presenting a new report. "Their communication chatter uses these names openly, so we assume they are not meant to be secret. This large armored vessel is called Bastion. The fast one is called Comet. The little patchwork ship, the one that looks barely spaceworthy, is called Second Chance." "Second Chance," Vector repeated. "An odd name for a warship. Indeed, Admiral. We also intercepted a transmission suggesting this ship was originally a fishing vessel, converted for orbital use, then later fitted with weapons, after some kind of conflict. The transmission was informal, almost like a joke among the crew. They seemed to speak of the ship with affection, not embarrassment. Vector found this detail more disturbing than anything else he had learned so far. In the Zathari Empire, an outdated or mismatched ship would be a source of shame. Crews assigned to older vessels were often seen as lower in status. No Zathari captain would speak fondly of flying an inferior, patched-together ship. And yet here was a human crew, apparently proud of their strange little vessel, naming it something almost sentimental. "What have we learned about their history?" Vector asked. "Why do their ships not match?" Austin pulled up a wider report, gathered from decades of old, half-forgotten scouting data that the Empire had collected on this system, but never bothered to analyze closely, since the species had seemed so unremarkable. "Admiral, this species calls itself humanity. Their homeworld, Earth, has never been united under a single government. For most of their recorded history, they were divided into hundreds of separate nations, each one independent, often in competition with each other, sometimes at war with each other. Even after they developed space travel, this division continued. Different nations, and later different private companies and colonies, built their own ships according to their own needs and their own designs. So there was never a single standard," Vector said. "No, Admiral, there were many. And it appears that even when humanity eventually formed something resembling a unified fleet for common defense, they did not force everyone to switch to one design. Instead, they simply combined what already existed: old ships, new ships, military ships, civilian ships converted for war. All of it, together." Vector found this almost impossible to accept. That is inefficient. That is exactly what led to disaster during the era of the Zathari clan wars. How can such a fleet function? How can supply lines work, when every ship needs different parts? How can command function, when every captain must think differently about how their own ship moves and fights? "I do not know, Admiral," Osun admitted. "But function it does. Our sensors show excellent coordination between their ships, despite the differences. It is possible that this diversity, which should be a weakness, functions instead as some kind of strength we do not yet understand." Vector dismissed Osun and sat alone for a long while, turning the problem over in his mind. He thought about his own fleet, the 200 identical cruisers arranged behind him in perfect formation, and for the first time in many cycles, he tried to imagine what might happen in a real battle between his fleet and this strange human fleet. His instincts, trained by a lifetime of Zathari doctrine, told him the answer was obvious. 200 cruisers, each one larger and more heavily armed than any single human ship, would simply overwhelm 41 mismatched vessels through sheer numbers and firepower. This was not a close call. This was basic arithmetic. But something nagged at him. A small detail from Osun's simulations. Every model his tactical officer had built assumed the humans would fight the way any single type of Zathari ship would fight, applied across their whole fleet. But the humans were not one type of ship. They were 41 different types, each with its own strengths, its own weaknesses, its own role. A tactic that defeated the armored ship Bastion might do nothing against the fast ship Comet. A trap designed to catch fast ships might be walked right through by the heavily armored ones. And the strange little patchwork ships, unpredictable by their very nature, could not be modeled at all. It was, Vector realized slowly, like fighting an enemy who never used the same weapon twice. He called for a full council of his senior officers. They gathered in the command chamber of the Voice of Order, 12 Zathari commanders, each one wearing the same uniform, each one having graduated from the same academy, trained in the same doctrine, taught to think about war in exactly the same way. "I want opinions," Vector said. "Should we engage this human fleet, or should we withdraw and gather more data before making a decision?" The most senior of his commanders, an older Zathari named Prevash, spoke first, as was tradition. "Admiral, with respect, I do not understand the hesitation. We outnumber them nearly 5 to 1. Our combined firepower exceeds theirs by a wide margin, even accounting for uncertainty in their weapons technology. This is not a difficult decision. We should engage and destroy this fleet, then proceed to assess whether their homeworld is worth adding to the Empire. Several other commanders nodded in agreement. This was, after all, standard Zathari thinking. Vector had thought the same thing himself, only a few days earlier. And if our tactical models cannot accurately predict their fleet's behavior? Vector asked. Austin has told me that no single strategy accounts for all 41 of their ships. What happens if we engage without a clear model, and something goes wrong? Pravash waved a hand dismissively. Admiral, even in the worst case, we would still win through sheer numbers. Even an imperfect strategy, applied by 200 ships against 41, should be more than sufficient. I understand your caution, but I believe it is unnecessary here. Vector looked around the table at his other commanders. Most of them seemed to agree with Pravash. Only one, a younger officer named Ithra who had recently transferred from a border fleet that had seen more unconventional combat than most, looked uncertain. You disagree, Commander Ithra? Vector asked. Ithra hesitated before speaking, clearly aware that disagreeing with the majority was not encouraged among the Zathari. Admiral, I served for 3 cycles along the border with the Kren Collective, where we occasionally fought against pirate fleets that used mismatched, salvaged ships, similar in some ways to what we see here. I learned that unpredictability itself can be a weapon. When an enemy fleet does not behave in a uniform way, our own coordinated tactics, which rely on every ship in our formation, knowing exactly what to expect from the others, can become confused. Our strength comes from acting as one. If the enemy forces us to react differently to every single ship we engage, that strength becomes harder to use. Pravash scoffed. Pirates with a handful of stolen ships are not the same as a serious military threat, Commander. You are comparing scattered raiders to an organized fleet. I understand the difference, Commander Pravash, Ithra said carefully. But the principle remains. Our doctrine assumes uniformity, on our side and on the enemy's side. When the enemy does not provide that uniformity, we lose some of our advantage, even if we still hold an advantage overall. I only suggest we proceed with caution, not that we retreat entirely. Vector considered both viewpoints carefully. He respected Pravash's experience, and the numbers did favor an easy victory on paper. But Ithra's words matched his own growing unease. The same feeling he had felt looking at the hologram of the 41 mismatched ships back on the Ilvantu's scouting report. We will proceed with caution, Vector decided. I will not throw away the safety of 200 ships and their crews on pride alone. Before we engage, I want to attempt contact. If this species can be reasoned with, perhaps we can avoid unnecessary losses on both sides. If they refuse contact, or if they attack first, then we will respond with full force. Pravash did not look pleased, but he did not argue further. Orders were orders, even among the Zathari, and Vector's rank gave him final say. The attempt at contact was made 2 hours later. Vector's communications officer sent a standard first contact message, translated through the Empire's automated systems, using the fragments of human language data gathered from old scans, supplemented by newly intercepted transmissions from the human fleet itself. The message was simple. It identified the Zathari Empire, stated that a large fleet had entered the edge of the Sol system, and requested that the human fleet stand down and allow for peaceful negotiation regarding the status of their system. The response came faster than Vector expected, and it was not what he had anticipated. It was not a threat. It was not a demand. It was, according to the translation, something closer to a question. They are asking us to identify our intentions before they will consider standing down, said the communications officer, a Zathari named Fessa. They state that Earth has been attacked before by other forces claiming peaceful intent, and that they will not lower their guard without clear proof. Attacked before? Vector asked. By whom? Unclear, Admiral. The translation is imperfect, but they reference at least 2 previous incidents involving other species, both of which apparently ended in combat rather than negotiation. Vector absorbed this new information slowly. If this was true, then humanity had already fought and survived encounters with other spacefaring species before the Zathari had even arrived. That would explain a great deal. It would explain the mismatched fleet, cobbled together from whatever ships could be armed and launched quickly in response to repeated threats. It would explain the wariness in their response. It would also mean this fleet, disorganized as it looked, had already been tested in real combat against alien enemies, and had survived long enough to still be here, still guarding their home world. Send a message, clarifying our intentions, Vector ordered. State that we seek only to observe and evaluate, and that no attack is planned unless provoked. Request a meeting between representatives, if their leadership is willing. The response this time took longer to arrive, nearly 6 hours, which Vector suspected meant the humans were debating internally, perhaps even arguing among themselves about how to respond, a very human thing to do, based on what little the Empire understood about their culture. When the answer finally came, it was cautious, but not hostile. The humans agreed to a meeting, but insisted it take place aboard a neutral vessel, positioned exactly between the two fleets, with strict limits on how many personnel and what kind of technology each side could bring. Vector agreed to the terms. As his shuttle prepared for departure toward the meeting point, he found himself studying the readings on the 41 human ships one final time, trying to understand what kind of species could survive multiple alien encounters, never unify their fleet under one design, and still manage to hold their ground against threats far more advanced than themselves. He did not yet have an answer, but he suspected he was about to learn a great deal more than he had expected when this mission began. As the shuttle left the voice of order and crossed the empty space toward the meeting point, Vector allowed himself a private thought, one he would never share with Pravash or the other commanders, who still saw this as a simple, easy conquest waiting to happen. Perhaps the reason humanity's fleet made no sense to Zathari doctrine was not because humanity had failed to learn the lessons of war. Perhaps it was because humanity had learned different lessons entirely, forged not in the calm order of a single empire, but in centuries of conflict, disagreement, and stubborn refusal to ever agree on just one way of doing things. And if that was true, Vector thought, then this small, mismatched fleet might be far more dangerous than its size suggested. The neutral meeting vessel was a small, unarmed transport ship, provided by the human fleet and inspected thoroughly by Zathari engineers before Vector agreed to board it. It floated alone in the empty space between the two fleets, a tiny speck surrounded on one side by 200 identical Zathari cruisers, and on the other by 41 mismatched human ships. Vector arrived with a small escort, as agreed. Waiting for him inside the transport was a human delegation of 3 people, along with a translation device that hummed quietly on the table between them. The lead human was an older woman with gray hair and steady eyes. She introduced herself, through the translator, as Fleet Admiral Elena Reyes, commander of what the humans called the Sole Defense Fleet. Grand Admiral Zul, she said, once the introductions were finished. I want to be direct with you. We have had 2 encounters with alien fleets before yours. Both of them assumed we were weak because we were new to space travel. Both of them attacked us. Both of them lost more ships than they expected to lose. I would like to avoid a 3rd such encounter, if possible. Vector studied her carefully. There was no fear in her voice, only a plain statement of fact, delivered the way a merchant might describe a business transaction. You claim your fleet defeated 2 separate alien incursions, he said. Forgive me, Admiral Reyes, but our own tactical analysis suggests your fleet's total combat strength is significantly below Zathari standard. How is such a claim possible? Reyes almost smiled. I imagine your analysis is very good at predicting the strength of a fleet that behaves like your own. I would guess it is less good at predicting the strength of a fleet that does not. You speak of your fleet's lack of uniformity, as though it were an advantage, Vector said. By every principle my people have learned over 1,000 years of warfare, uniformity is what wins wars. Standardized ships, standardized tactics, standardized supply lines. Difference creates confusion. Confusion creates weakness. For you, maybe, Reyes said. For us, it created something else. Let me tell you a little about our history, Admiral Zul, and maybe you will understand. Over the next hour, Reyes explained what Vector's officers had already begun to piece together, but hearing it directly from a human leader gave the story new weight. Humanity had never been one people speaking one voice. For most of their history, they had been divided into competing nations, each with different languages, different governments, different ways of building things. When humanity finally reached space, this division did not disappear. Different countries and companies built their own ships, their own stations, their own colonies, often without much coordination between them. When the first alien fleet arrived, 3 years ago by our calendar, we did not have a single unified military, Reyes said. We had dozens of separate space programs, some military, some civilian, some barely more than research outposts. There was no time to build a matching fleet from scratch. We used what we had: mining ships, research vessels, passenger transports, a handful of actual warships that a few of our nations had built for their own defense. We combined all of it, as fast as we could, and we fought with what we had. And you won, Vector said. It was not quite a question. We survived, Reyes corrected. That first fight nearly destroyed us. We lost 11 ships and thousands of people. But the enemy fleet, which I believe belonged to a species your empire may know as the Kren, also lost far more ships than they expected to lose, and they eventually withdrew, rather than continue the assault. Do you know why? Vector said nothing, waiting for her to continue. Because every one of our ships was a different problem for them to solve, Reyes said. Their doctrine, like yours, assumed some kind of standard enemy. They had tactics designed to counter warships built a certain way, with weapons positioned a certain way, with engines that moved a certain way. Our mining ships did not fight like warships. Our fast transports did not fight like slow cargo haulers converted into gun platforms. Every time the Kren commander thought he understood our fleet, a new ship would do something his models had not predicted, because that ship had never been designed to fight in the first place, and its crew had to improvise entirely new tactics on the spot. Vector thought of Austin's frustrated reports, the 41 separate simulations that never combined into a single reliable model. He was beginning to understand. You are describing chaos as a weapon, Vector said slowly. Not chaos, Reyes said. Adaptability. There is a difference, Admiral. Chaos is when nobody knows what they are doing. What we have is closer to the opposite. Every one of our crews knows exactly what their ship can do, because they built it, or modified it, or have spent years learning its specific quirks. They are experts in their own vessel, even if that vessel does not match any other ship in the fleet. And when we fight together, each captain contributes something different to the whole. The fast ships scout and harass. The heavy ships anchor the formation and absorb damage. The strange little ships, the ones that look unfinished or mismatched to your sensors, often carry the most creative solutions, because their crews had to improvise from the very beginning, just to make them spaceworthy at all. Vector was quiet for a long moment, processing this. He thought about the Zathari clan wars, centuries ago, that had led to the standardization laws. He had always been taught that those wars proved uniformity was the only path to strength. But perhaps, he now considered, those old clan wars had failed not because the ships were different, but because the clans themselves had refused to cooperate, had refused to communicate, had refused to see their differences as anything other than a source of division. Humanity, it seemed, had found a way to keep the differences while still working together as one. You mentioned 2 previous encounters, Vector said. What happened the second time? Reyes's expression grew more serious. The second attack came about a year after the first, from a different species. We do not know their name for themselves. Our people call them the Silent Ones, because their ships never communicated, not even to demand surrender. They simply attacked. That fight was worse than the first. We lost more ships. But by then, we had learned from our mistakes. We had built new ships, specifically to fill gaps in our fleet, that the first battle had exposed. We did not try to make all our ships match each other. We tried to make sure every gap was covered by something, even if that something looked nothing like anything else in our fleet. And you won again, Vector said. We survived again, Reyes repeated, with the same careful correction as before. The Silent Ones lost enough ships that they withdrew. We do not know if they will return. We built Second Chance, the little patchwork ship your scouts likely noticed, from the wreckage of that battle. Half of her hull came from a ship we lost. The crew who serves on her now are volunteers who survived that fight and wanted to keep flying, in a ship built from the ashes of what we lost. It is not efficient, Admiral Zul. I understand that. But it means something to us, and it turns out that a crew who believes in their ship, however strange it looks, fights harder than a crew flying a ship they feel nothing for. Vector sat back in his chair, absorbing everything Reyes had told him. He thought of his own crews, trained from birth in Zathari academies. taught to see their assigned cruiser as simply one interchangeable unit among 1,000 identical vessels. He wondered, for the first time in his long career, whether that interchangeability came with a hidden cost. A cruiser that could be replaced by any other cruiser was easy to manage, easy to predict, easy to repair. But was it a ship that a crew would fight to the last breath to protect? Or was it simply a job, a post, a number in a formation? "I will be honest with you, Admiral Reyes," Vector said finally. "My empire did not come here planning peace. We came here to evaluate your species and your system for potential annexation. Many of my officers still believe that a direct assault would end this quickly, given the numerical advantage we hold." "I appreciate the honesty," Reyes said, without any visible fear. "I would say the same thing to you that I said to the Kren commander before he made his decision to withdraw. You may win. Your numbers are real, and I will not pretend otherwise. But you will not win cheaply, and you will not win in a way your doctrine can predict in advance. Every ship in our fleet is a different question, and you will have to answer every single one of those questions while we are actively trying to kill you. I do not think that is a fight your empire truly wants. Not for a system as small as ours. Not when the cost may be far higher than your commanders currently believe." Vector considered this for a long moment. He thought of the 200 identical cruisers waiting behind him, each one a mirror of the last, trained under a doctrine that had never truly been tested against an enemy like this. He thought of Ithra's warning during the council meeting, about unpredictability as a weapon. He thought of the strange little ship called Second Chance, built from wreckage and crewed by survivors who believed in something more than a uniform design. "I will need to consult with my empire before making any final decision," Vector said. "But I will tell you this, Admiral Reyes. You have given me a great deal to think about. My people built an empire on the idea that sameness creates strength. I am beginning to wonder if we have been wrong about that for a very long time." Reyes studied him carefully, as though trying to decide whether to trust his words. "That would be a rare thing, Admiral Zul. An empire willing to question 1,000 years of doctrine because of one conversation." "Perhaps," Vector said. "Or perhaps it only takes one conversation, when the doctrine has never truly been tested before. My empire has fought many wars, Admiral Reyes, but we have never fought a war against an enemy who refused to be predictable. I suspect that is about to change, one way or another, whether through conflict or through something else entirely." The meeting ended without a final agreement, but also without violence, which Vector considered, in itself, an unusual outcome for a first contact between two fleets, with such different philosophies of war. As his shuttle carried him back toward the voice of order, he looked out at the scattered, mismatched shapes of the human fleet one more time, and for the first time since arriving in this system, he did not see 41 weak, inefficient ships. He saw 41 unanswered questions, each one waiting for a Zathari commander foolish enough to attack without understanding what he was truly facing. When Vector returned to the voice of order, he called another full council of his senior officers. He relayed everything Admiral Reyes had told him, including the accounts of the 2 previous alien encounters, and humanity's unusual approach to fleet building. He expected some of his officers to be persuaded, as he had been. He did not expect the reaction he actually received. "This is exactly what I would expect a weaker fleet to claim," Prevash said, his tone dismissive. "Of course they will tell you stories of great victories against powerful enemies. What better way to discourage an attack than to convince us we cannot win easily? Admiral, I believe you have been deceived by clever words, nothing more." Several other commanders nodded along with Prevash, and Vector felt a flicker of doubt. Perhaps Prevash was right. Perhaps Reyes had simply told him a convincing story, designed to make her weak fleet sound more dangerous than it truly was. It would not be the first time a desperate commander had tried such a tactic. "I do not believe she was lying," Ithra said quietly. "Our own scans confirm damage patterns on several of their ships consistent with real combat, not staged effects. The wreckage used to build their ship Second Chance shows genuine battle scarring, dated to roughly the time frame Admiral Reyes described. If this was a deception, it was an extremely elaborate one." Prevash waved this away. "Damage can be manufactured. Old wreckage can be repurposed for exactly this kind of theater. I still believe our numerical advantage is decisive, and I do not believe we should delay further based on unverified claims from an enemy commander." The council remained divided for nearly an hour, with Vector listening more than speaking. weighing the arguments on both sides. In the end, it was not words that settled the matter, but events. A priority transmission arrived from the Zathari homeworld, relayed through the Empire's long-range communication network. It came directly from the Imperial Court, and its message was blunt. The Emperor's Council had reviewed Vector's initial reports, and had grown impatient with the delay. They ordered Vector to proceed with the annexation of the Sol system immediately, treating any resistance from the human fleet as confirmation of hostile intent, to be answered with overwhelming force. Vector read the order twice, his unease deepening with each pass. The Imperial Court, safe and distant from the Sol system, had not seen what he had seen. They had not spoken with Admiral Reyes. They knew only the numbers Osun had first calculated, 200 cruisers against 41 mismatched ships, and to them, that math alone was reason enough to expect an easy, decisive victory. He had no choice but to obey. Zathari law did not permit a Grand Admiral to ignore a direct order from the Imperial Court, however uncertain he felt about the wisdom of that order. "Prepare the fleet for engagement," Vector said, the words heavy in his mouth. "Send a final message to Admiral Reyes. Inform her that our empire requires the Sol system to submit to Zathari authority. Give her one final chance to stand down without conflict." The response, when it came, was short and unwavering. Humanity would not submit. The battle began 3 hours later. Vector had expected the human fleet to hold a defensive position near their home planet, forcing his own fleet to come to them, fighting on ground of their choosing. Instead, the 41 ships spread apart the moment the Zathari fleet began its approach, breaking formation in a way that Osun's models had never predicted. "Admiral, they are not holding together," Osun reported, confusion evident in his voice. "Their fast ships are moving to flank our formation on both sides. Their heavy ships are advancing directly toward our center, but slowly, as though inviting an attack. Several of their smaller, unidentified vessels have simply vanished from clear sensor tracking, likely using some kind of stealth technology we did not detect before." Vector watched the tactical display with growing concern. His own fleet moved as it always had, 200 cruisers in a tight, coordinated formation, every ship responding to the same central commands, every weapon firing in synchronized volleys, designed to overwhelm a similarly organized enemy fleet. It was beautiful to watch, in its own way. It was also, Vector realized with dawning alarm, exactly the kind of predictable formation that a fleet built to counter uniformity would know precisely how to break apart. The first exchange of fire came sooner than expected, from an unexpected direction. 3 of the human fast ships, including the one called Comet, darted along the outer edge of the Zathari formation and unleashed a coordinated strike against a cluster of 6 cruisers on the fleet's left flank. The attack was precise, aimed not at the thickest armor plating, which Zathari doctrine assumed any attacker would need to overcome, but at specific weak points near the engine housings, details that should not have been visible to an unfamiliar enemy without extensive prior study of Zathari ship design. "How did they know to target the engine housings?" Vector demanded. "Unknown, Admiral," Osun said, his voice tight. "Perhaps their sensor technology is more advanced than our estimates suggested. Perhaps they studied wreckage from an earlier scouting mission we are not aware of. 2 cruisers report critical engine damage. They are falling out of formation. This should not have been a serious problem on its own, 2 damaged ships out of 200, but the sudden gap in the tight formation created a ripple effect. Nearby cruisers, trained to maintain exact spacing with their neighbors, began adjusting their positions to compensate, and for a brief but critical moment, the perfect uniformity of the Zathari fleet wavered. The heavily armored human ship, Bastion, chose that exact moment to make its move. Rather than continuing its slow approach toward the center, as Osun had predicted, it suddenly accelerated, driving directly into the gap left by the 2 damaged cruisers, absorbing punishing fire from nearby Zathari ships without slowing, its thick plating shrugging off blow after blow that would have crippled a standard Zathari vessel of similar size. "It is drawing our fire," Ithra said, watching the display, with something like reluctant admiration. "It is sacrificing itself to hold that gap open, allowing the smaller, faster ships to exploit it." Vector watched in growing disbelief as 3 more human ships, ones he had not even seen approaching, slipped through the gap that Bastion had forced open, using the confusion and the concentrated fire on the armored ship as cover. These smaller vessels moved deep into the heart of the Zathari formation before anyone could react, and once inside, they began targeting supply and command ships that had been positioned safely at the fleet's rear, protected on the assumption that the outer formation would never be breached. "Admiral, we are losing coordination across multiple squadrons," Osun reported, real alarm in his voice now. "Our central command relay has taken damage. Several cruisers are receiving conflicting orders." Vector understood immediately what was happening, and the understanding filled him with a grim, unwelcome respect. The Zathari fleet's greatest strength, its perfect coordination through a centralized command system, relying on every ship trusting the same signals and following the same doctrine without deviation, had just become its greatest vulnerability. The humans had not tried to match Zathari's strength for strength. They had found the one weak point that a uniform fleet would always share, the reliance on that uniformity itself, and they had struck directly at it. "Order the fleet to disperse and adopt independent tactical control," Vector commanded, his voice sharp with urgency. "Every cruiser captain is to use their own judgment until central command is restored." This should have been a simple order to follow, but Vector watched with growing frustration as his captains, trained for their entire careers to follow precise central commands and never deviate, struggled to adapt to sudden independent decision-making. Some cruisers hesitated, waiting for orders that were slow to arrive. Others overcorrected, breaking formation entirely and leaving themselves isolated and vulnerable to the human ships that had infiltrated the formation's heart. The battle raged for nearly 2 hours. Vector watched, torn between the tactical necessity of directing his fleet and a strange, dawning fascination with what he was witnessing. Every human ship fought differently. The fast ships struck and withdrew before Zathari weapons could get a clean lock. The heavy ships absorbed damage and held ground with stubborn persistence. The strange little patchwork vessels, the ones his own officers had initially dismissed as barely spaceworthy, proved to be the most unpredictable of all, appearing in unexpected places, using tactics that seemed improvised on the spot, as though their crews were making decisions no simulation could have anticipated, because the ships themselves had never been designed with any single purpose in mind. By the time the battle finally slowed into an uneasy standoff, both sides had suffered real losses. 14 Zathari cruisers had been destroyed or disabled beyond immediate repair. 6 human ships had been lost, including, Vector noted with a strange pang of something he did not expect to feel, the little ship called Second Chance, which had thrown itself into the path of an attack clearly meant for a larger, more valuable vessel nearby. 14 cruisers lost, against 6 human ships. On paper, this still favored the Zathari Empire, given the disparity in fleet size. But Vector understood now, watching the tactical display with a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with the numbers, that this had not been the easy, decisive victory the Imperial Court had promised itself. This had been a real fight, hard-won, costly, and far closer than 200 ships facing 41 should ever have been. "Order a ceasefire," Vector said quietly. "Signal Admiral Reyes. I wish to speak with her again, immediately." Pravash, injured and shaken from the loss of ships under his own command during the battle, did not argue this time. None of the council did. The numbers had told them one story before the fighting began. The battle itself had told a very different story, and even the most stubborn among them could no longer ignore what they had witnessed with their own sensors. As Vector waited for a response from the human fleet, he stared out at the wreckage scattered across the space between the two forces, Zathari and human debris mixed together in the aftermath of a battle that should never have been this close. He thought of Second Chance, built from the wreckage of an earlier fight, now itself becoming wreckage in this one. He wondered whether some future human ship would someday be built from its remains, carrying its memory forward the way it had carried the memory of the ship before it. For the first time in 1,000 years of Zathari history, Grand Admiral Vector Zul found himself questioning not just a single battle, but the entire foundation his empire had been built upon. The second meeting between Vector and Admiral Reyes took place aboard the same neutral transport ship, though this time the atmosphere between them had changed completely. Both fleets had bled. Both commanders had watched ships they were responsible for burn in the dark of space. There was no more room for doubt on either side about what this conflict could cost. 14 of my ships, Vector said. I did not expect that number, Admiral Reyes. I will admit that openly. I did not want it to be that high either, Reyes said. And for the first time, Vector heard genuine weariness in her voice, not the careful calm she had shown during their first meeting. We lost 6 ships. One of them was Second Chance. Her crew survived, most of them, but the ship did not. Vector thought of the little patchwork vessel, and the strange pang of feeling he had experienced watching it fall. I am told your crew spoke of that ship with something like affection. I am sorry for its loss, even as your enemy. Reyes studied him for a long moment. That is an unusual thing for a Zathari Grand Admiral to say to me, after ordering an attack on my home system. I did not choose this attack, Admiral Reyes, Vector admitted, surprising himself with his own honesty. I was ordered to proceed by my Empire's Imperial Court, against my own recommendation. I had hoped, after our first conversation, that we might find another path. My superiors did not share that hope. They believed the numbers alone guaranteed an easy victory. And now? Reyes asked. What do the numbers tell you now, Admiral Zul? Vector was quiet for a moment before answering. The numbers tell me that a fleet of 200 identical ships lost 14 vessels to a fleet of 41 mismatched ones, in a battle that should have ended quickly and decisively in our favor, by every calculation my officers made beforehand. The numbers tell me that my Empire's entire military doctrine, built over 1,000 years and never seriously questioned, may be fundamentally flawed when facing an enemy that refuses to be predictable. Reyes leaned back slightly, clearly not expecting such a direct admission. That is a significant thing to say, Admiral. It is, Vector agreed, and I do not say it lightly. I have served the Empire faithfully for 30 cycles. I believed, until recently, that uniformity was the only true path to military strength. Your fleet has shown me otherwise. Every ship of yours that survived that battle did something my officers could not predict, because no 2 of your ships think the same way, fight the same way, or make the same decisions under pressure. My fleet's strength has always come from perfect coordination. Your fleet's strength comes from something else. Perhaps from trusting each individual crew to solve problems in their own way, using whatever tools they happen to have. We did not plan it that way at first, Reyes said. It was born from necessity, not wisdom. We simply did not have the luxury of building a matching fleet when the first attack came. We used what we had, and we learned, slowly, painfully, that the differences between our ships were not a weakness to overcome, but something we could use deliberately. By the time the second attack came, we were building new ships specifically to be different from what we already had, filling gaps rather than duplicating strengths. It became a strategy, not just an accident. Vector considered this carefully. I would like to propose something, Admiral Reyes, though I do not know if my Empire's Imperial Court will accept it. I would like to propose peace between our 2 peoples, not conquest. I believe continued conflict would cost both our fleets more than either side can afford to lose, and I no longer believe an easy victory is possible here, regardless of what the numbers on paper suggest. Reyes did not answer immediately. She studied Vector for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. Why should I trust this offer, Admiral Zul? Your Empire has shown us, through both words and actions, that it sees my people's system as something to be taken, not respected as an equal. You should not trust it blindly, Vector said. You should trust the evidence instead. 14 cruisers lost in a single engagement is not a number my Empire can easily dismiss or hide from its own people. I intend to bring a full and honest report back to the Imperial Court, one that does not minimize what happened here. I believe, once they understand the true cost of continuing this conflict, even the most stubborn voices among my superiors will reconsider the wisdom of further attacks against your system. And if they do not reconsider, Reyes asked, if your Empire simply sends a larger fleet next time, determined to overwhelm us through even greater numbers, regardless of the cost? Vector met her gaze steadily. Then I believe your fleet will find new and unpredictable ways to make that larger force pay a heavy price as well, just as you did today. I do not say this as a threat, Admiral Reyes. I say it as an observation. Whatever else is true about your species, you have proven, twice now against 2 different alien powers, that you do not surrender easily, and you do not fight the way your enemies expect. That is not a lesson my Empire will easily forget, whatever the Imperial Court ultimately decides. The 2 commanders spoke for several more hours, working through the difficult details of what a lasting peace might look like between 2 such different powers. It was not a simple agreement, and by the end of the conversation, many questions remained unresolved. But by the time Vector returned to the voice of order, a fragile ceasefire had been established, with both fleets agreeing to withdraw to a respectful distance, while their respective governments considered the path forward. Vector's report to the Imperial Court, sent later that day, was the most honest and detailed account he had ever submitted in 30 cycles of service. He described the battle exactly as it had happened, including the losses, the tactical failures caused by the fleet's own rigid coordination, and the unexpected effectiveness of an enemy fleet built entirely on difference rather than sameness. He included Asun's tactical analysis, showing in precise detail how the human fleet's mismatched ships had exploited weaknesses that a uniform fleet like the Zathari Empires had never needed to defend against before, because no enemy had ever attacked that way. He did not know how the Imperial Court would respond. Perhaps they would dismiss his report and demand a second, larger assault, determined to prove that overwhelming force could still win, where clever tactics alone had failed. Perhaps some among the court's leadership, as stubborn as Pravash had been, would refuse to accept that the ancient doctrine of uniformity, unquestioned for 1,000 years, could have any real weakness at all. But Vector also allowed himself a small measure of hope. The Zathari Empire had not survived and grown for 1,000 years purely through stubbornness. It had also survived through a willingness, however reluctant, to learn from costly mistakes when the evidence became impossible to ignore. 14 lost cruisers, against a fleet less than a quarter the size of his own, was evidence that would be very difficult for even the most traditional voices in the Imperial Court to explain away. In the weeks that followed, as the ceasefire held and formal negotiations slowly began between Zathari diplomats and human representatives, Vector found himself returning often to his private quarters aboard the Voice of Order, studying the tactical records from the battle again and again. He thought about the strange, mismatched shapes of the human fleet, and about Admiral Reyes's words regarding trust and difference, and the deliberate choice to let every crew solve problems in their own way, rather than forcing them all into a single mold. He thought, too, about the little ship called Second Chance, built from the wreckage of an earlier loss, flown by a crew who believed in it despite its patchwork appearance, and who had ultimately given everything to protect a larger, more valuable ship during the battle. He wondered whether any Zathari crew, trained from birth to see their vessel as simply one interchangeable unit among 1,000 identical others, could ever feel that same fierce personal loyalty toward their ship. Perhaps, Vector thought, that was the true lesson buried beneath all the tactics and numbers. Uniformity had built the Zathari Empire, and it had built it well, for 1,000 years of relatively predictable warfare against enemies who thought in similar terms. But humanity had shown him something the Empire's doctrine had never accounted for. That a fleet built not from sameness, but from the freedom to be different, to improvise, to care deeply about a strange and unmatched vessel simply because it was theirs, could become something far harder to defeat than any calculation of raw numbers could ever predict. Months later, when the formal peace treaty between the Zathari Empire and humanity was finally signed, granting Earth's system recognized independence, and establishing the beginnings of careful trade and diplomatic relations between the two powers, Vector requested, and was granted, permission to attend the signing ceremony in person. He stood beside Admiral Reyes as the agreement was finalized, two commanders from two very different worlds, brought together not by shared strength, but by the costly lessons of a single battle neither side had truly wanted to fight. Before he departed Earth's system for the long journey home, Vector asked Reyes one final question, one that had lingered in his mind since that first strange scouting report so many months before. Why do you build your ships this way, Admiral Reyes? Even now, with peace ahead of you, and the resources to build a more unified fleet if you chose to, I have seen your shipyard's new designs. They still do not match each other. Reyes considered the question for a moment before answering. Because uniformity assumes you already know the perfect way to solve every problem, Admiral Zul. We have never believed that about ourselves. We have always believed that different people, thinking in different ways, building different solutions, will find answers that a single perfect design never could. It cost us a great deal to learn that lesson, but it has also saved us, twice now, against enemies who believed their sameness made them unstoppable. Vector thought about those words for a long time on the journey home, and he suspected he would continue thinking about them for the rest of his long career. The Zathari Empire had ruled 400 star systems through the unshakable belief that sameness meant strength. It had taken a small, strange, mismatched fleet from a single unremarkable star system to teach a 1,000-year-old empire that perhaps, in the vast and unpredictable dark of space, there was more than one way to build a fleet worth fearing. And somewhere in that vast dark, humanity's shipyards continued their work, building yet another new and unmatched vessel to add to their fleet, each one a little different from the last, each one a fresh answer to a question that no enemy, however powerful, had yet learned how to ask correctly.